They really fired her for giving soup to a black man? That's what folks kept whispering days later. But none of them had seen it like I did. They didn't see the look on her face when she got called out. Not for breaking rules, but for breaking the one rule you never say out loud in places like this. Don't make folks like him feel like they belong. All she did was offer warmth to a man who looked like he hadn't been seen in years. And for that, she was thrown out like trash. The craziest part? The man they treated like a beggar? He wasn't just someone. He was the one person who could change everything. And he did. The sky over Beaumont Hills hadn't fully brightened when Imani Johnson clicked on the lights inside Oak Ridge Diner and Gas. Outside, last night's snow clung to the roof and blanketed the parking lot like ash from a long, cold fire. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered awake with a buzz, bathing the diner in pale glow. Imani moved quietly behind the counter, breath still visible in the chill that hadn't yet lifted. She wiped down surfaces with practiced hands, her rhythm calm, familiar. The scent of old coffee mixed with frying oil as the first early truckers pulled in. Faces lined, tired, but grateful. She greeted them all by name, her voice warm and steady. It was more than routine. It was dignity in action. To Imani, every shift was a chance to do what her father, a late Army sergeant, had taught her. Leave people better than you found them. A smile, a refill before they asked, a moment of care. They weren't extras. They were the job. The rhythm of the morning soothed her. The hiss of eggs on the grill, Tony's boots scuffing the tile, the soft country soul music whispering from the radio. But something had changed since the new district manager arrived. Madeline Carver had swept in like a corporate winter storm. Clipboard tight, heels sharper than her tone, and no time for extra friendliness. She'd already docked hours, banned the community bulletin board, and chastised Imani for taking too long with elderly customers. Imani held her line anyway. Kindness wasn't some upcharge. Folks came here not just for gas and biscuits, but to feel a little more human before the next long stretch of road. Her dad's old Army medal, a small, worn silver star, stayed tucked inside her apron pocket, a reminder of sacrifice, of service, of why she chose to keep smiling even when Madeline walked by like she owned every breath in the building. That morning, as she poured the first cup of dark roast and adjusted the napkin holder, she had no idea how close she was to the moment everything would crack wide open. The jingle of the front door barely rose above the fryer's hum. She glanced up and saw him, a black man in a tattered army jacket, standing motionless near the entrance. Snow melted in lines under his boots. His canvas bag looked heavy, as if it carried more than belongings. His eyes, bloodshot, sunken, met hers for a flicker before dropping again. "Not looking for charity," he rasped. "Just wondering if there's work. Anything." Imani looked around. No Madeline yet. The dining room quiet. She stepped forward with a nod. "Coffee's on me. And I've got stew left from last night." He hesitated. "Can't pay." She smiled, already ladling it out. "Doesn't mean you don't deserve to eat." And with that simple act, she broke a rule far older and far more cruel than any policy Madeline could put on paper. He sat at the corner booth, still unsure if he belonged there. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the spoon to his lips. The beef stew, thick, warm, peppered with tender potatoes, hit his tongue like memory. Across the counter, Imani pretended not to watch him too closely. But she saw it. The mist rising from his eyes, the way he held that coffee mug like it anchored him to the moment. "You gave me more than food," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You gave me my dignity." Imani didn't answer right away. Her throat tightened. She simply nodded and turned to refill the sugar jar, letting the silence speak for both of them. The man didn't look like trouble. If anything, he looked like he'd already had enough of it for several lifetimes. Something about him, his posture, his silence, reminded her of her father on nights when the war stories pressed too close. He didn't even finish the whole bowl, just sat there slowly, as if savoring the one moment of peace the day had offered. But peace doesn't last long in places like Oak Ridge, especially not under the watchful heel of Madeline Carver. The sharp clack of her boots announced her arrival before anyone saw her. She marched in through the side door, a gust of cold trailing her tailored coat. The diner tensed as if it instinctively braced itself. Madeline's eyes scanned the room like radar until they locked on the booth in the corner. She didn't even pause at the counter. "Imani," she barked, voice slicing through the soft clatter of dishes. "Why is that man eating without a receipt?" The diner froze. Tony stopped scraping the grill. Maria looked up from the register. Imani held her ground, voice steady. "He came in out of the cold, asked for work. I offered him a meal." Madeline didn't blink. "On whose authority?" "Mine," Imani said. "It's just stew and coffee. He's a veteran." She gestured to the duffel and the faded jacket, the subtle patch at the shoulder. "He didn't ask for anything. I offered." Madeline crossed her arms, clipboard pressed tight to her chest. "That's not your decision to make. This isn't a shelter. It's a business." The man stood slowly, duffel in hand. "Didn't mean to cause trouble," he muttered. "I'll go." He fished into his pocket and pulled out a few wrinkled bills. Madeline sneered. "Put that away. We don't take guilt money from freeloaders." Her voice echoed. The insult burned through the air like acid. Imani stepped between them. "That's enough," she said firmly. "He didn't beg. He didn't ask. I made a choice." "Then you chose to violate company policy," Madeline snapped. "That's theft." "You're calling this theft?" Imani said, stunned. "A bowl of soup? You're done here." Madeline extended her hand. "Name tag and apron. Now." The room fell silent. Even the friar seemed to pause. Imani's hands shook slightly as she unpinned her tag, folded the apron neatly, and set them on the counter. Around her, the regulars stared, disbelief on their faces. No one said a word. Even Tony, usually gruff but dependable, seemed frozen. Maria's eyes welled. As Imani gathered her coat, the man rose quietly and followed her toward the door. When it closed behind them, the warmth she'd built every morning seemed to vanish with them, leaving only the bitter cold, the kind that didn't come from the weather, but from the way some people decide whose kindness counts and whose never will. The wind bit harder outside than Imani expected. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she stepped off the curb, coat clutched tight against her chest. Her breath came out in sharp bursts, hot against the frozen air. The man walked a few steps behind her, quiet. She wasn't even sure where she was going. Maybe home, maybe nowhere. The cold didn't bother her. It was the silence inside the diner that stung. That silence had weight. It told her everything she needed to know about how much Madeline's authority had shaped the place, and how little her own integrity had mattered in the end. "Miss," he called out. She turned. He was jogging to catch up, his duffel slung over one shoulder, his breath visible in short clouds. "You dropped this." In his gloved hand was something small and silver. Imani stared, her heart catching. It was her father's old army medal, worn, dented, engraved with initials she hadn't been able to part with since the funeral. She hadn't even realized it had fallen from her apron pocket in the commotion. "Thank you," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she took it. This means everything." The man nodded slowly. "You take care of people. That still matters." He hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a black leather notebook. Far too nice for someone with torn gloves and second-hand boots. "What was her name?" he asked. "The manager." Imani blinked. "Madeline Carver." "Why?" He scribbled something quickly with a pen that looked just as out of place. "Sleek, metallic, expensive. Just something I keep track of," he said simply, tucking the notebook away. She tilted her head, instinctively cautious. "Why are you really asking?" He offered a small smile, not smug, not suspicious, just knowing. Some folks still believe the way people treat strangers says everything about who they really are. There was something about the way he said it. Calm, measured, like someone who wasn't just passing through. Imani watched him walk away, slowly, purposefully, his silhouette fading into the snowy sidewalk. She stood there a long time, holding her father's medal in her palm, unsure if she felt grief, anger, confusion, or something else. Maybe hope, maybe not. But whatever had just happened, it didn't feel like an end. It felt like the start of something that hadn't finished writing itself yet. Back inside the Oak Ridge diner, Madeline's voice filled the room again. Louder now, more confident, as if punishing the silence that had dared to question her. She rearranged sugar packets, barked directions at Tony, double-checked the temperature logs. Maria moved quietly around her, saying nothing. The regulars sat low in their seats, murmuring softly, some shaking their heads. But no one spoke up. Not yet. The atmosphere had turned clinical, stripped of the warmth Imani used to bring with nothing but her presence and that steady, unshakable voice. Then, the bell above the front door jingled. Heads turned. The man from earlier stepped back inside. This time, though, he walked differently. Gone was the shuffle, the hesitation. His back was straight, his eyes clear, and in his hand, that same black notebook. He moved toward the counter calmly. "Miss Carver," he said, voice even. Madeline turned from the kitchen. Her smile was tight. "I thought I made myself clear. You're not welcome here." He didn't flinch. "Just a few questions," he said, already flipping open the notebook. "How long have you been managing this location?" Madeline stiffened. "Excuse me, are employee terminations made solely at your discretion?" he continued. She glanced around. Maria froze mid-step. Tony stood still at the grill. "Who are you?" she snapped. "Some kind of health inspector?" He looked up. "Let's just say, I report directly to the person who signs your checks." The air shifted. Even the clock ticking on the far wall seemed to pause. Madeline's lips parted, faltering. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" he replied, writing something. "Because from what I've observed, your idea of leadership seems to involve humiliation, control, and fear." And with that, he snapped the notebook shut and walked back out, leaving a silence so loud it rang through the walls. It wasn't even 20 minutes before the low rumble of a diesel engine cut through the diner's white noise. A deep Navy pickup pulled into the lot, polished and steady like it had nothing to prove. As the door opened, wind carried in a wave of snow and silence. A tall black man in his early 70s stepped out, broad-shouldered beneath a wool coat, his dark fedora angled with quiet precision. He moved like someone who had fought more battles with words than fists, but knew how to win either way. Inside the Oak Ridge diner, the bell chimed as he entered, and the room shifted around him like a tide had come in. Madeline looked up from the counter, already fixing her smile. "Mr. Moore," she said, voice sweetened with surprise. "We weren't expecting a visit." But Richard Moore didn't return the smile. His gaze cut straight through the room like a laser, landing exactly where he meant it to. "Where is Imani Johnson?" he asked, voice level but cold. Madeline straightened, clipboard pressed tight. "I had to let her go this morning," she said crisply. "She gave away food to a transient without permission. It was a clear violation of policy." Richard raised an eyebrow, then turned, slowly, deliberately, toward Tony and Maria. "That sound accurate to you?" Maria hesitated, then stepped forward. "Sir." She gave a bowl of stew and coffee to a man who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. He didn't ask. She offered. Richard nodded once. No drama, no reaction, just listening. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled out a phone, tapping the screen a few times. "Let me tell you about that man," he said. He turned the screen toward Madeline. On it was a message. "You were right about this location. She fired the girl. Called me a freeloader. I've got everything documented. Franklin." Madeline's face drained of color. The name hit her like a slap. "Franklin Moore," Richard said softly. "My son. And the man you threw out." The room froze. Coffee cups halted mid-sip. Plates stayed untouched. Tony whispered something under his breath. Madeline's lips trembled. "Sir, I didn't know." He looked. "Like what?" Richard cut in. "Like he didn't deserve to be treated like a human being?" His voice stayed calm, but the weight in it pressed hard. He came here to see how your team operated, what kind of values you represent. And what he found, he shook his head, was not integrity. It was hierarchy built on fear. From his coat pocket, Richard pulled a thick manila envelope and laid it on the counter. 6 months' worth of reports, anonymous staff complaints, time card manipulations, reduced hours after doctor's notes, accusations of intimidation, a complete dismantling of the culture we spent years building. Madeline stammered, "Sir, with all due respect, those complaints are exaggerated. I've improved profitability by double digits." Richard didn't blink. Profit doesn't excuse abuse. He began laying out pages, screenshots of emails, shift logs, statements. The weight of each sheet turned the air heavier. You threatened to fire someone for calling out sick with a 102-degree fever. The silence was crushing now. Richard looked around the diner, not at the numbers but at the people. "Then today," he continued, "you fired an employee not for breaking the rules, but for doing what we've always expected, treating people with decency." His eyes returned to Madeline. "You humiliated a veteran. You demeaned a black woman in front of her community. And you lied about it." Madeline opened her mouth, but Richard held up a hand. "We're done here." He turned to a man near the door, broad, uniformed, badge glinting. "Deputy Simmons will escort you to collect your things. Keys, badge, all of it." Madeline's composure shattered. "You're firing me?" "Effective immediately," Richard said. "There's no room for cruelty at Oak Ridge." As the deputy stepped forward, Madeline looked for someone, anyone, to speak up, but no one did. Not this time. Outside, the wind still howled, swirling snow across the lot. Imani stood by the curb, hands buried in her coat pockets, heart still raw. She hadn't expected to be called back. Tony had simply texted, "Come quick, trust me." Part of her didn't want to. Pris de Stung. Humiliation lingered. But when the diner doors opened and Richard Moore himself stepped outside, she froze. He walked toward her. Not rushed, not stern, but with the calm resolve of a man who had made up his mind. "Ms. Johnson," he said, offering his gloved hand. "You deserve more than an apology." She blinked. "Sir, Come inside," he interrupted gently. "Please." Inside, the diner had changed. Not in its walls or lighting, but in its air. Something had shifted. The wait was gone. Employees gathered around the counter. Maria, Tony, even a few truckers still nursing coffee they hadn't touched in minutes. They all looked at her, not with pity, but with something else. Respect. "You didn't just do the right thing," Richard said, voice carrying through the room. "You did the human thing, and that matters more than rules written in ink." Imani stood frozen as he continued. "We need that kind of leadership here, which is why I'd like to offer you the role of shift supervisor, effective immediately, with full discretion to lead this place with empathy, not fear." A quiet gasp passed through the room. Maria's eyes lit up. Tony grunted with a proud smirk. Before Imani could answer, another figure stepped forward. Clean-shaven now, in a crisp overcoat. Franklin Moore, no longer hiding behind snow and shadows. "You didn't know who I was," he said, tone soft. "But you saw a man in need, and treated him with respect. That doesn't go unnoticed." From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small patch, faded, frayed at the edges, but unmistakably military. "This belonged to my brother. He said people like you were the reason he made it home." Imani took the patch with shaking hands, her throat too tight for words. Richard looked on. "Say yes, Imani. We're rebuilding something here, and it starts with you." She blinked away tears, straightened her shoulders, and nodded. "Yes, sir. I'd be proud to." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was real. It echoed between linoleum and old booths, warmed the edges of a space that had felt sterile for too long. In the days and weeks that followed, Oak Ridge Diner and Gas transformed, not with paint or slogans, but with purpose. Imani's name tag read supervisor, but it wasn't the badge that made her different. It was the way she listened, How she asked Maria about her mother's surgery schedule before approving hours. How Tony got every Sunday off for his grandkids. The bulletin board returned, covered in thank you notes, local flyers, even a lost dog photo. But the real change was the chalkboard by the register, where customers added tally marks for meals prepaid. No questions asked. Over 300 meals and counting. Franklin visited every week, checking in on staff like an unofficial morale officer. And Richard? He didn't return often. But when he did, he sat at the corner booth, quiet, watching, knowing. Imani never forgot that snowy morning. One bowl of stew. One act of defiance. One ripple that turned into a wave. Because sometimes, justice doesn't arrive loud. It walks in on worn boots and leaves behind a warmer world.